I'm confident that the Supreme Court will not take what would be an unprecedented, extraordinary step of overturning a law that was passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress.
The President was talking about matters like this that involve the Commerce Clause, that involve Congress passing legislation to deal with issues of national economic importance.
President Obama, you heard there, taking on the Supreme Court over its review of health care reform, and then White House spokesman Jay Carney being forced to walk back, at least in part, some of what the President said. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Steve Hayes from the Weekly Standard, Mara Liasson of National Public Radio, Byron York of the Washington Examiner, and David Drucker of the Roll Call newspaper. Welcome all. Happy Easter to everyone. So, Steve, those remarks by the President reverberated through the whole week and are still pinging around. What about them?
They did. I mean, I think there were three problems with them: the tone, the substance, and the timing.
Other than that, they were great?
Other than that, they were just fine. I mean, the tone, the President appeared strident, I think. He appeared angry, and that's never a good posture for the President to take, at least in terms of talking about the Supreme Court. On substance, he made several mistakes. It would not be unprecedented for the Supreme Court to overturn such a law. It wouldn't be extraordinary, and it didn't pass by a strong majority in a democratically elected Congress.
So, Mara, the White House seemed to be eager to stamp out the impression that the President didn't know what he was talking about on a constitutional matter, and to try to get this thing behind the President. What was the political effect in your judgment?
Well, I think, first of all, I think what the White House was trying to correct was that the President spoke too broadly and he wasn't specific enough. Obviously, it's not unprecedented for the Supreme Court to overturn a law passed by Congress. The President certainly knows that. But when it comes to, they wanted him to say when it comes to economic activity under the Commerce Clause. What I think the political message here is that the ground is being laid for what you might call a war on the court, that liberals and the President now will be making the kind of argument that conservatives used to make if the Supreme Court does overturn this, that you had 26 Republican attorneys general, you had 5 Republican-appointed Supreme Court justices overturning a law passed by Congress, and this is conservative judicial activism. I think that's what you're going to hear if the court does go ahead and overturn this.
Well, there was one more issue, which is the hypocrisy issue here, because at the same time the President was sort of condemning the court for thinking about knocking down a duly constituted law passed by a strong majority of a democratically elected Congress. The President's lawyers from the Justice Department were in Boston in the First Circuit asking that the court strike down the Defense of Marriage Act, which passed with 342 votes in the House and 85 in the Senate, a huge bipartisan majority. And at the very same time the President was talking about unelected judges should not have the discretion to strike down a law passed by Congress. His lawyers were asking a court to do that very same thing in Boston.
I'm not convinced, Britt, that the President and Democrats didn't say what they said and have been saying on purpose. I don't know that this was a mistake that they've now been walking back because it was a problem for them. I think that after the Supreme Court arguments, they recognized that the court could rule against them, and that's why during the week of arguments you heard Democratic senators arguing that the individual mandate was hatched by Republicans, and so essentially if this is unpopular, it wasn't our idea. And the President wants to have something to run on if the court overturns him.
The President also said in those remarks, listed among the reasons why the court should leave the Obamacare law in place, that it was important for the country and the people benefit and so forth. It is not appropriate, is it, for the Supreme Court to judge the constitutionality of a law based on whether it's good social policy or not?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, the question is it constitutional or is it not? Although you heard in the oral arguments, remember when the President nominated Sonia Sotomayor, there was much discussion about this empathy standard. And you heard her actually in her questioning raise some of these very same policy issues and talk about the people who were likely to not be covered if this law were to be invalidated. So he's in a sense making in that statement comments that echo both questions from Sotomayor and things that he has said in the past about empathy standards.
Now, Mara, David suggests that whether the President was too broad in his assertion or not, that he's staking out this territory. You suggested something like that. Do you think this works politically?
That's a good question. When I first started asking people at the White House and other Democrats long ago, will you go to war on the court if they overturn it? That's one of your options. And the response then was no, because people do respect the Supreme Court as the final arbiter. You know, we didn't have riots in the streets when Bush versus Gore was decided. In other words, that's a very risky proposition. But I do think that Democrats were taken aback by the kind of partisanship they heard in those oral arguments. The fact that Justice Scalia was talking about what could pass with 60 votes, that seemed to be something clearly the domain of Congress, not the court. They think that they see the Supreme Court as acting in a partisan manner, and I do think...
Partisan or ideological?
Ideological. Okay, let's call it ideological. And I do think, although it's risky, they're going to have an answer to the question of how could this constitutional law professor have signed a law that was unconstitutional. Either he's right or they're right.
That's an
and they're going to have an answer to that, and I think that that's going to be a critique of the court.
Has been made, Byron, that the president can kind of win if the law is struck down. It takes it. It's unpopular. It takes it off the table as an issue, and makes it easier for the president. You buy that?
I don't buy it, and I don't think the president buys it either, because if the law is struck down in whole or in part, Republicans will say that in 2009 and 2010, when the public was desperate for a president to concentrate on creating jobs and fixing the economy, the president instead spent all of his time passing this massive new intrusive health care law, and it turned out to be unconstitutional. That is a devastating critique of the president. Certainly Democrats don't want that.
I think we should remember, too, this isn't the first time in American history we've seen a president go to bat against the Supreme Court and for some sort of political accommodation to be seen.
While a case is pending?
I'm not sure if while a case is pending, but we know that FDR battled with the Supreme Court, and after his packing the court scheme failed, many people believe that the reason the courts ended up finding much of his agenda constitutional, and a lot of it was thought to be radical at the time, they thought it was because even the court wanted an accommodation with the president.
In other words, he'd work the refs, in effect.
Correct. And I think that the president is doing that.
Working the refs.
Yes. The decision isn't necessarily made. I'm sure there's a lot of debate going on inside the court, and he wants to send the message that if you strike this law down, there could be mayhem, and not mayhem in the streets, but that people could lose their health insurance. It would be bad. We know that the courts have acted before with social impact in mind.
So your view is that he's operating on sort of politics on two levels. One is this is a line of attack that works for him politically within his own party and perhaps for the fall. And two, that it might get him a better decision.
Correct. And I think Democrats want to see this out of him. His base wants it.
But this is why the timing is problematic for the president. When he made his argument in that statement, he said that there was a heavy burden on the court to demonstrate why they would overturn such a law. That's the precise opposite of the argument that Anthony Kennedy made when he was questioning so aggressively in oral arguments. Yeah, he said the heavy burden is on people who would make people participate in commerce.
Let's do a quick round of guesses here. None of us is a fortune teller or a soothsayer, but do you think it'll be upheld? Or
I am not reading too much into oral arguments. I think it'll be upheld.
Whoa, it sounded like they were willing to strike it down, 5 of them.
Strike down the mandate, not the whole law.
I'm with Byron. Strike down the mandate, send it back to Congress, fix the rest of the law.
Panel, thank you. We've got to take a break here. When we come back, we'll preview the general election in dueling speeches this week. Panel weighs in on the Romney and Obama plan.